I'm very pleased to be here today. I think this is my 10th Integrate that I've attended. I only missed 1 year. And it's also my 7th year in a row that I've been invited to speak. So I really want to thank Kovai for giving me the great opportunity. It's a privilege and an honor to be up here in front of all of you. And I do want to apologize in advance. I came down a couple of days ago with a bit of a bug. I'm still trying to debug it, but I think I've got a few more breakpoints to go through. So hopefully my voice will hold out and you won't have to put up with too much coughing and sputtering. So yesterday you had a great presentation from Stefan who talked about why integration is so hard, right? Well, you all know that it's challenging. It's probably one of the reasons why you're here, right? So that you can learn and share your experiences with everyone else. So I'm not going to rehash what Stefan went through, but I'm just going to briefly go through maybe a slightly different angle on this. So integration in itself requires some core capabilities and skills, which in themselves are somewhat complicated, right? The concepts of, I'm sure you all know about Hope's enterprise integration patterns, and you all know about the main core features that an integration platform or solution requires. You have to understand messaging, you have to understand transformation, you've got to understand orchestration, connectivity, API management, all that goodness, which in themselves is a lot to learn. Not everybody is able to get across all of that and those challenges. But it doesn't stop there when you're doing your solution, because you also have to deal with all of the non-functional requirements that go with any solution. So for example, scalability. And just deploying a solution to the cloud, which is potentially infinitely scalable, does not make your solution scalable, right? You actually have to architect your solution to be that way. You have to make sure that it performs well. And depending on your situation, there could be very stringent requirements for that. I remember working on integration for a new hospital where the latency had to be like in microseconds because people's lives depended on that. You have to make sure it's a resilient and robust platform, that it can handle disasters when things go down. Certainly has to be secure. I'll let Nino's presentation speak for itself yesterday about that. It has to be maintainable. It has to be also comply with standards not only from the organization, but maybe sometimes externally. There may be legislative requirements you have to deal with. So that's a lot, and those things mean that they introduce a lot of extra peripheral concerns and capabilities, which as an integration specialist, you may not necessarily be experts in. Like as an integration architect, I'm certainly not an expert in network topology, for example. But these are all things that we have to deal with when we're building integration solutions. And then of course, if we're going to do it in Microsoft, we have to learn how to do that in Azure. I feel like some of Microsoft's competitors in the integration space has some advantages because a lot of those other products are bundled as dedicated products for integrations. Like, if you think about MuleSoft or Boomi or Tibco, like they come packaged all in the box. You know exactly what you're getting. You generally, you theoretically supposedly have some idea what it's going to cost. And, you might have to learn that technology, but there's a boundary around it. Whereas when we are asked the question, how do you do integration in Microsoft, our answer is Azure. The trouble is, this is what Azure looks like, right? Now, we know that that's a great story. It's a phenomenal story because I would dare say that there are few cloud providers out there that can offer the same breadth and variety of services that Microsoft Azure offers us. And that makes everything we build very extensible, right? But it's obviously daunting. It's a challenge to try to get across, especially if you're new to trying to develop solutions. And it's a problem for customers too, because they look at that and there's a perception issue here, right? Why am I paying for all of that when all I want is integration? And how do I know that I'm getting best of breed? It's a perception issue, but perception is reality when you're trying to sell. So Microsoft responded to that a few years ago by creating Azure Integration Services. And as Stephen W. Thomas pointed out to you the other day, it's really just a marketing label that's placed on top of a few specialized services in Azure that we know are critical to delivering integration, right? And it came along with a nice little white paper, too, that kind of talked about how you can build an integration platform using these specific services. So that was helpful, wasn't it? Did you not find it helpful? Yeah, absolutely. It helped from the customer perspective. It helped from a technology developer perspective because they understood how they were going to use these specific services to deliver an integration platform. But it doesn't stop there, right? Because what the white paper didn't address is all those peripheral concerns and requirements that I showed you on the first slide, right? And we know that even, as well as you know these specific services, it doesn't address everything else, and those are the things you have to deal with when you're building a platform. So how many here, hands up, are familiar with the Cloud Adoption Framework? Okay, a few. Actually, you all should have heard about it yesterday during Steve Jan's presentation when he introduced it. But if you haven't looked at this or been across it, I strongly urge you to check it out, because this is tremendous guidance and resource for us as developers. Basically, it's a full lifecycle framework that provides you the best practices, documentation, and the tooling to basically provision business and technology strategies for the cloud. Now, one of the key aspects of the CAF is landing zones. And a landing zone, well, there's Microsoft's definition for it, but basically, in other words, a landing zone really is like a predefined, secured, multi-account environment that's ready to onboard workloads and teams in an automated manner. That automation is actually very important. It basically allows you to very quickly provision an entire environment through code. And this environment would have been constructed with the well-architected framework from Microsoft, so you can guarantee that it's going to be scalable. Remember I said that just because the cloud is scalable, in theory, not everything you build is necessarily scalable. But these solutions would have been designed by Microsoft to make sure that they'll support scalable solutions. It's also modular, because it's not a one-size-fits-all, right? Organizations need to be able to pick and choose the particular functionality and services that they need. Now, there's two types of landing zones. Platform is, I think, I kind of want to use the word infrastructure, but I won't, because infrastructure implies virtual machines and stuff. So think about it as all of your shared services. Think of it as the stuff that's fundamental to building your platform. So, for example, networking, identity, or your management services and monitoring capabilities and stuff. But you can also have application landing zones, too, that delivers specific bits of functionality or capability. So an example, the CAF gives you a platform landing zone that's actually quite large. It basically lays out for you, through multiple subscriptions, all the things that you would need for an enterprise cloud solution. And then it also provides a number of application landing zones. And you can see from this list that it would provide things like, for example, if you want an AKS solution, or if you want to introduce SAP. It's great. It's phenomenal. But it did not include specifically an enterprise integration platform landing zone. And that's what we've got now. Just a few months ago, the Azure Integration Services landing zone was created. And as you can guess, following along with the CAF principles, it basically gives you a way to automate the implementation of an enterprise integration platform. And it does it in a modular way. And it also includes, and perhaps what I think is maybe the most useful part of this, is a bunch of reference documentation that basically gives you all the guidelines and best practices. And it presents a number of articles that present design considerations, which are the things you need to think about before you start building, and then the design recommendations for how you address those things. And those 6 design areas are here. If you look at them, you can see that they kind of cover a lot of those peripheral concerns that we talked about on the first slide. So it's exceptionally useful. This isn't teaching you how to do enterprise integration patterns. It's teaching you how you can build effective solutions in Azure, addressing all of those concerns that maybe, as integration specialists, we're not necessarily experts in doing. So I want to shout out, of course, the main contributors. This was a Microsoft initiative, and it was headed up by Kent Ware and his team, Kunal and Jordan, and also contributions from an MVP named Elkan. But also Microsoft had contracted Aphanos to help with this, and Daniel and Jason both contributed a fair amount to help building this out. So some of you might remember Daniel was here on the first day. I don't think he's here now, but some of you might know that he was also involved in the BizTalk Migrator a lot. So we can thank these gentlemen for their efforts. I'd like to briefly cover the design areas, not just to go through them in depth because there's no time, but just to introduce from a helicopter view what kind of topics are covered in each of these so you can understand just how useful these references are. So we'll start with identity and access management. And to be clear, this is really about the deployment and maintenance of the Azure resources. We're not talking about, like from an application perspective, like securing endpoints and stuff, right? So the design considerations, which are things that you need to think about when you're starting to build this, well, first of all, understand who your personas are. Who is it that you're actually defining your access and your capabilities for? Because that's going to govern the kind of roles that you set up. And you want to consider separation of duties, right? So that you have people who are responsible for different bits. I mean, unless it's a very small organization, it's not likely going to be one person who's going to do everything, right? You're going to have people who are doing different roles and therefore will need different levels of access. And consider, of course, what are the actual integration service resources that you're going to use and what kind of controls that you need to put on them. Because there are also, again, unless you're a very small organization, you're probably going to have people that specialize in dealing with certain kinds of resources as opposed to others. And then from the recommendation point of view, obviously the principle of least privilege is the one that we should always follow from a security and an access perspective. It's so easy to just give everybody God access because then you don't need to get bothered about when people have to chase you asking for permissions, but clearly that's not a very secure way to do things. And Azure gives us a very, very powerful mechanism to achieve that. So role-based access control can work at the highest level, like roles at a subscription, all the way down not only to the resource, but actually the operations that you could do on a resource. So there's really no excuse not to use that capability. There are thousands of built-in roles in Azure across all the different kinds of resources. But if you can't find your specific one in there, you can also create custom ones if necessary. And you're going to see Azure policy mentioned a lot through all this documentation because it's such a great mechanism to kind of automate and control compliance and restrictions across almost all aspects of the solution. Now we move on to the next design area, which is network topology and connectivity. And this is actually the largest piece of documentation that they include in the solution. It's extremely helpful, especially for people who are networks illiterates like me. So the first question that you probably ask is, what is your actual network model? Is it a traditional hub and spoke, where you generally have a hub that has all your central network capabilities, like your firewall and your DNS and your routing rules and stuff, and then you have other networks that connect through that? It's a very common model, and it gives you a lot of control. But the thing is, if you want to do transitive access, which is say, if network A connects to network B and network B has access to network C, by default, A doesn't necessarily have access to C. If you want to do that, you've got to create user-defined routes and possibly a network virtual appliance to handle that. So it can be a little bit more complicated. And in a larger organization, you may even have multiple hubs set up. The other alternative is to use a virtual WAN, which is where Microsoft manages all of that connectivity for you. And it makes things a lot simpler. So whichever one you choose, obviously, is going to have an impact on your architecture. Next is, of course, planning for your IP addressing. If you're doing a hybrid situation where you've got a network in the cloud that has to connect to your on-premises network, you've got to make sure you're not overrunning the IP addresses. A VPN gateway can help with that through the use of a NAT. And also be aware that certain Azure Integration Services need dedicated subnets like APIM and Logic Apps. You also want to think about whether you need a custom DNS or whether you can use Azure Private DNS. There's there's differences and advantages to both of those. In thinking about encryption and security, where are you going to terminate your TLS? Are you going to terminate it at the external point where the internet comes into contact, or do you need to carry it all the way through into the organization, into the various systems? And are you going to have to do authentication in multiple places? If you are using a hybrid scenario, you're going to have to figure out how are you going to connect those cloud services to your on-prem. We have several options today of how to do that. If you got the ExpressRoute already set up, well, that's a fantastic solution, obviously. But if you don't, then you may think about on-prem data gateway or hybrid connections. They each come with their own sort of limitations. And since most, if not all, of these Azure Integration Services are PaaS services, they don't by default live inside of a virtual network. But many of our organizations are going to require that network connectivity. So how are you going to connect them and attach them to that? And again, you have a couple of options there. You've got service endpoints, or you could do private endpoints with private link. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses. So the recommendations, and this is the most extensive part of the documentation. For each and every Azure Integration Service listed here, there is a section in the document dedicated to how you do network connectivity for each of those components, including its own design considerations and recommendations. I think it's incredibly useful. Again, for people who are network illiterates like myself, I would be following this very closely. And there is, in the documentation too, there is a diagram that explains how the reference architecture that it deploys does that kind of network connectivity. And it does provide that for you. It includes a VNet in there. So there's a nice diagram, and you can see basically how they're using private endpoints in their reference solution. The next area, of course, is security, very important area. I guess first up, you've got to depend on what is your exposure to your solution. Are you using, is it a private cloud where everything is only internally exposed, or are you going to have stuff that's exposed to the internet, or is it a factor of both? Obviously, very different security concerns there. And if it is going to be publicly exposed, then you got to think about what your obfuscation strategy is going to be. So you don't want to betray your underlying technologies, which are very apparent sometimes with the default URLs that you get, for example. But there are ways to deal with that and ways to obfuscate it. Some recommendations for security. I'm not going to take the time because I will run out of time if I go through each one of these. But you should recognize most of these as being pretty standard ways. If you're not using managed identities, you probably need to ask why you're not, unless you're a glutton for pain, because that definitely, yeah. And yeah, most of those will make sense. You see Azure Policy is mentioned again. It's a very useful way for enforcing security. And Microsoft Defender is also a great way for being able to detect vulnerabilities that you might have and giving you options to address it. There's a few more as well. So I'll just continue with that. And then from management, this is often, when we're building solutions, an afterthought for us. We're so bent on having to make the thing work that we forget about the fact that people have to look after it after it's in place. So it's good to think about these things up front. So some of the questions you might need to ask yourself is, what am I going to need to monitor? How am I going to track my processes end to end through it? What kind of external connections am I going to need for monitoring? Like especially if you've got systems that are outside of your organization that you're connecting with. Do I need a dashboard built for that to help monitor that? And also very important, what kind of queries are going to be executed when this goes live? And this isn't necessarily diagnostic queries for troubleshooting faults. It's also from a business perspective as well. What is your CEO or your CIO going to ask? What kind of questions? You need to think about that when you're building your solution. And what kind of management tasks are required too? Are you going to need a way to resubmit messages, for example, that fail? And how will you do that? So some of the recommendations. App Insights is an incredibly powerful capability in Azure. If you haven't used that extensively, you really should investigate it because it's tremendous, fantastic how much information it exposes for you. And with a log analytics backend, log analytics gives you the ability to consolidate all your logging information from across all your Azure services in one place. So you can really get that sort of end-to-end visibility through everything. If you're using logic apps, there are a few properties there that you can utilize to help tracking end-to-end. So there's a client tracking ID, and there's also track properties, so you can define your own custom properties to log identifiers through and kind of glue everything together. And we have, with App Insights and Azure Monitor, we have a lot of great monitoring tools in Azure itself, but if there are some needs that aren't being met by that, there are also some third-party tools out there. For example, there's a product called Serverless 360 by a company called Kavai. Maybe you've heard of it? Serverless 360 is a great product. You would have seen yesterday in Michael's presentation about what it does. There's a lot of added value it can give you because it can kind of define your applications at an application level and not on a resource level, which is really helpful. Another section included in here is some sample Kusto queries. So you would remember from yesterday's presentation, Kusto is a query language that we use over log analytics. But if you haven't used it before, it's a kind of a different syntax for it. So having some sample queries in there is really helpful to get across that. And then we come to governance. So you got to think about who's responsible for making decisions about this. So we come back to roles and responsibilities. Is there an architecture review board? Is there a change management board? Chances are there will be, especially at a large organization or any organization that's mature in that regard. Do you need a DR plan? Are your systems critical? And if you do, then have you defined your RPO and your RTO? Because those are essential to figure out how you're going to manage that in Azure. Do you have an alert escalation plan? Are there any compliance regulations that you need to follow? As I said, sometimes these can be internal to an organization. It could be external as well. It could be legislative requirements. GDPR is a perfect example of that. And what kind of tooling do you have for remediation if it falls out of compliance? So in governance, again, Azure policy. It's an excellent mechanism to do this. It can actually just enforce it for you automatically. And you should automate everything as much as you possibly can. Because not only does it make it more efficient and more consistent, but there's also the auditing aspect of doing everything through automation. And again, role-based access control, we've already talked about that. And if Azure Monitor doesn't serve your purposes, then there are third-party tools like Serverless 360 that you can use. Also, Microsoft Defender for Cloud is really, really good for that, to keep checking and letting you know if something falls out of compliance. And then the last area is platform automation and DevOps. I'm not going to go through these things in detail, but I think a lot of this should be familiar to you. It's important to ask yourself the question is like, for branching strategy, for example, there are many different types. There's trunk-based development, there's GitHub flow, and GitLab flow. Subtle differences there. You need to decide what's going to work best for your organization. And in terms of self-hosted agents, if you're talking about stuff that's, if you're connecting things that are inside of a virtual network, the Microsoft-hosted agents may not have access to that when you're doing DevOps, so you might have to consider self-hosted agents. So recommendations, basically deploy early and often, fail fast, right? Shift left and find your problems as soon as possible. Separate infrastructure from application deployment is a good idea. We have separate pipelines for both because obviously your infrastructure stuff is going to change far less often than your application stuff. I hope nobody is storing secrets in their source control, especially after you saw Nino's presentation yesterday. And just some basic things about testing and making sure that you do peer reviews and that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's the design guidance that you get with the landing zones. So now if we look at the reference architecture, There is an automated deployment that allows you to set up an enterprise integration platform, and these are the services that it deploys for you. As you can see, it's pretty standard. And you can see also that it deploys everything in the context of a virtual network. That's important to know because that has a cost perspective on it. Everything is laid out with ARM templates for this, and you can see that it's modularized in that each of those services has its own folder and its own template, which then gets referenced by the one master template that deploys everything. And that's helpful because it means that you can sort of pick and choose what you want from that. But I think at this point, rather than showing you screenshots, I'll actually just go directly into the and show you directly. So everything is in a public Git repo that you can see, and on the landing page, you've got a bit of an executive summary about what it's all about. Oh, I have not. Oh, you're right. Okay. Sorry about that. I have to stop the presentation to do that. Okay. Sorry. You can see that now, right? Yes, but not the right screen. There we go. Okay, so this is the landing page for the public Git repo, and you've got a nice little table here that has links to all of the different design documentation that we just spent our time talking about. So, for example, if I want to go into identity and access management, you can see the layout of the page. You get a bit of an overview. You get your design considerations, your design recommendations. There's often a lot of links embedded in here to take you to more information. And there's always a further reading aspect at the bottom with even more information available. So you can see those, they all live here under this documents folder. And then if we want to go to the reference implementation, if you just look under scenario 1, we have a reference implementation page. And this talks about that diagram again that shows you what gets deployed, describes it, and you've got this nice little deploy to Azure button. So that's not something you're likely to do in production, obviously, but if you're having a play, it's a really, really easy way to get going. So I'll just demonstrate that for you now. If we click Deploy to Azure and then make sure that you're signed in to Azure, that always helps, it's going to open up a custom template page. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with this feature in Azure, but it basically allows you to load up an ARM template and then and tweak it and deploy it. Oh, sorry, the internet's being very slow. Okay, here we go. So this is actually, I meant to show you first, sorry, that all those ARM templates actually live in the GitHub repo under the source folder. And there is a scenario 1 and a scenario 2. I'll talk about scenario 2 in a moment, but under the infra folder, under scenario 1, you can see that we have all of our ARM templates are laid out, just as I showed you in that screenshot. What this does is it loads up that template for you, and you get a nice view in here with a tree view that shows you the structure of the ARM template, very basic. It's got your parameters, your variables, and your resources. And your parameter file, but the parameters are all presented here in this nice GUI interface. So if I want to deploy this, I'm going to have to, sorry, one other feature. In Visualize, it's a little visualizer here, which actually shows you the different deployment packages and how they relate to each other, which is kind of nice because you can instantly see what the dependencies are between everything. So for example, if I decide I don't really want the app insights and want to remove it, well, I can see that there are at least 3 things that are dependent on it, and I'm going to have to tweak those deployment packages accordingly. But if I wanted to get rid of Data Factory, and yes, you can move these things around, then I don't really have to worry about dependencies so much. Okay, that's kind of a handy little feature. So in the parameters, like every Azure resource you ever deploy, you've got to specify your subscription. You've got to specify a resource group. I'll just choose this existing one because I'm not actually going to do the deployment now. It will take an hour, and the next presenter won't appreciate that very much. You have a region that you specify, and then you're given here an option for a system prefix. Now, all that is going to be a token that's in the name of every single item that you deploy. So that could be, say, an example of your organization or your department. Take a hint from the length. Keep it pretty short, okay, because it's going to be part of every name, and you're going to run into problems if it's too long, right? Because your names will be too long. You also have an environment here as well that you can choose, and that is really just another token in the environment, in the naming convention, actually, to help separate that. And don't worry that there's only 3, because you can actually customize that very easily in your template here in the environment variable. It's just an array that you put in there. Don't edit. Resist the temptation to edit in here, by the way, even though it lets you, because the moment you click save here, you're going to break the deployment. And the reason is remember how we had all that modular structure, where you have the master template and you have all the different templates in their own folders? They're referenced here through a template link property which has a relative path. So right now it knows that this template is in the Git repo and it can find this stuff, but the moment you edit this file, it becomes a local copy, all those links break. So I wouldn't do that. So if the other things in here, the address spaces and the subnet stuff, I probably wouldn't touch that unless you really know what you were doing, because Microsoft has already worked out what those should be. You can specify an admin email in an organization. And if I go click Review and Create, you're going to get a nice warning here. Well, first it's going to do validation to make sure that it will work. But Microsoft is going to let you know here that when you actually deploy this, you're actually putting stuff into your subscription, and you're going to start getting billed for it. And it's not going to be insignificant, because with the VNet capability, most of you know that most Azure services require a premium level to be able to afford that. So it's going to cost a bit. And then you can go ahead and click Create, and when you click Create, it's going to actually start deploying those resources into your subscription. So with that template, that master template, you can actually edit it if you want to start removing things. And obviously, again, this is not the way you would deploy anything to production. What you would do is take a copy of that repo, those scripts, and modify those scripts the way you want, and deploy them either with CLI or put them into an Azure pipeline. Okay, so that's going to start the deployment. And you'll start seeing things appear in there. I'm going to cancel it, though, right now, because I don't want to blow out my subscription. I do already have it deployed already, so I've done this. And this is the resource group I had it deployed to. And if you look, you can see all the resources that are in here are showing that little token I put in, the 007, and the environment name. And there's about 39 resources that are created. Most of them have to do with network stuff, but you can see you've got your APIM, you've got your service bus, you've got your logic apps, and all of that in there. Now, keep in mind that these are just, they're empty in the sense that there's no application-specific stuff in here. So the APIM management, for example, has no APIs deployed, except for the Echo API that always comes with it. Service bus will have no topics or queues. Your logic apps will have no workflows or schemas. It's just all ready there for you to add your stuff to it. All right. With that, I'm going to go back to the slides and see where I am in this, and hopefully it remembers where it was up to. Yes, it did. Okay. All right. Cool. Yeah. Advance, please. There we go. All right, so what gets deployed? I've given a little table here that identifies what it is. As you can see, there's a lot of network stuff and the numbers. And the cost factor is just highlighting for you what are the most expensive things that are in there. Obviously, a premium service bus is going to be one of the most expensive items in there, as well as the app service plans for both the functions and the logic apps, because they have to be premium level as well. So what does it actually cost to run? So I let this run in my subscription for a couple of days, and it basically came out to about $35 US a day, just to run the platform stuff. And again, you can see that it was service bus and the app service plans that basically accumulated the most cost. So remember, again, there's nothing functional running in here. There's no traffic or anything. It's just the platform itself. And the other thing to be aware of is that it gives you a little bit of a break in that it deploys the developer version of APIM. which has all the same features as the premium, but there's no SLA. And you can't use that in production, right? So if you're going to put this in production, be aware that your cost is going to be significantly higher when you go. So something to be aware of there. And briefly, I did mention it was a scenario 2. This is more of I would say, an application landing zone in that this is a specific solution for being able to integrate ServiceNow with Microsoft Teams in there. So it's an example of that. There were going to be more scenarios coming along. Now, whereas the platform level 1 had implemented with ARM templates and gave you a nice deploy to Azure button, this one actually is in Bicep. So you get some Bicep examples in here. But you don't get your deployed Azure button. You'll have to use CLI, and you'll have to also set up a couple of service principals. So it's a little bit more complicated for this one. So the next steps. There is in the Git repo a project board where you can go in and see what's on the backlog and what are the things that they're going to be added to it. So there's some new scenarios that they want to add. There's some new patterns. There's also a backlog step to change scenario 1 to Bicep. But the reason it isn't that way now is because the custom template feature in Azure doesn't support Bicep yet. And if you want to get involved, they would welcome your contributions. So you'll need to get a contributor license agreement in place, but that's pretty easy to do. And yeah, actually, Microsoft would love to have your input on it. There's a list of references here, and I will be sharing the slides. And I also want to just shout out the Integration Down Under group. For those of you who live in the Asia Pacific area and are tired of all the webinars and stuff that's happening at a very unfriendly time for you, we meet every month on Thursday evenings, and we have and there's a great YouTube site where we record all the videos, so do check it out. There's a lot of great presentations there. And with that, I'll say thank you. I don't know if I have time for questions or not. I do? Okay, awesome. Do we have any questions? Yes?
Storage account in a private network when you disable public access. I think it's time to make only single private endpoint, not several private endpoints for every single subtypes for the services there. It's increasing issues.
Get a microphone for...
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if there's anybody who has a microphone. So you're saying that when you're setting up a private network, you want to create a...
storage account, it's recommended to have only one private endpoint that presents all the subtypes, the subservices, instead of having several of them. Yeah, especially when we are talking here about... Yeah, especially when we are talking here about...
It's not on.
Hello? Yeah.
There we go.
So what I was saying, a single private endpoint for a storage account in a private network when you disable public access for that storage account. Because in that case, it's more accessible and you don't have to create a private endpoint for each sub-service. Like if you are going to use a blob, so you have to create a private endpoint for the blob. If you are going to deal with files, so you have to create a private endpoint for files in that storage account. Specifically when you are talking about logic app standard in a private network, as you presented here as Azure Integration Services as a platform. So in this case, we have to create several private endpoints for a single storage account to be used with logic app. So that's the point.
Okay, I see. It sounds like that's something you would be asking Microsoft to address then. Yeah. Okay.
May I answer this question?
Yes, please.
I think it is correct to have... I think it is correct, in my opinion, to have the possibility to create a different endpoint for single resources, because looking about what I explained during my session, you may have very high confidentiality for very specific resources, storage resources. So you actually need to handle very high confidentiality, so private endpoint for very specific storage. It can be log, file, whatsoever.
I think we can take this discussion, but my point here is it's already in private network. The public access is disabled already. So
Yeah, absolutely. I get your point, but getting much deeper in this topic about confidentiality, you may have very specific confidentiality reason for specific storage endpoint. That is my point.
But in a large organization, you may not necessarily want everybody in that organization to access everything, right?
Because you can access in one private endpoint with actually access to a blob within the same file or in the same endpoint, but they actually have a different reason to be such a confidentiality, right? It's a kind of segregation of duty of confidentiality.
Probably sounds like an offline discussion we can have. Are there any other questions? Thank you very much for your time.